This episode is sponsored by Circle K. Get the most savings on every gallon when you fuel with the Circle K Fleet Card. Learn more at CircleKFleetCards.com.
Welcome to HDT Talks Trucking. We're looking at the biggest stories of the month. I'm Vesna Brajkovic, Managing Editor of Heavy Duty Trucking, and I'm here today with Editor-in-Chief Deborah Lockridge to talk about the highlights of December 2021. The top story by far was the sentencing of a truck driver to a 110-year prison sentence for a 2019 crash in Colorado that killed 4 people. And this sentence was one that received a ton of national attention, even from the likes of celebrities like Kim Kardashian. So Deborah, you've been covering this story. What can you tell us about it?
Thanks, Vesna. There's been quite an outcry about the length of this sentence for the truck driver. His name is Rogelio Aguilera Medeiros. Nearly 5 million people signed a petition to send to the governor. The Colorado Motor Carriers Association also sent the governor a letter asking for a reduced sentence. And truck drivers threatened boycotts of the state on social media using the hashtag #NoTrucksToColorado.
And there was really no doubt that this crash that occurred in April 2019 was horrific. I mean, the driver has said what happened was he lost brakes on Interstate 70 near Denver, and he careened down a 5-mile stretch of steep highway before slamming into traffic that had stopped, and then that resulted in an inferno.
Yeah, it said 4 people died, multiple injuries, property loss, and yeah, no doubt it was horrific. And I'm sure just the idea of that people dying trapped in their cars helped the prosecution in this case. And I think there's no doubt really that this driver made some big mistakes when he hit that grade. The speed limit for trucks was 45 miles an hour, which he was going much faster than that. The runaway ramp, he went right by the runaway ramp, reportedly at well over 60 miles an hour. By the time he hit the bottom and hit this line of traffic that was stopped from their accident, he was going estimated 80 to 85 miles an hour. So prosecutors threw the book at him. They emphasized the idea that of negligence, really gross negligence in ignoring that speed limit and going by the runaway ramp. And so he was convicted earlier this year on 27 charges, including 4 counts of vehicular homicide. But what really caused the hubbub was not the convictions, but the length of the sentence. 110 years. The judge in the case said he didn't have a choice, that it was Colorado sentencing guidelines required the sentences to be served consecutively, like one after the other, instead of concurrently, which would be like at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so he said the driver had made a series of terrible, reckless decisions, but he still said that if he had had his choice, it would not have been that long.
And wasn't there some question about how much he knew about driving in the mountains to begin with?
Yeah, that definitely has been a topic of discussion. Our equipment editor, Jim Park, dug into this shortly after that crash in 2019. The driver was from Texas, not exactly an area known for its hilly, mountainous terrain. He was 23 years old, apparently hadn't been driving out of state very long. So it's quite possible he really didn't understand how important it was to take that hill slowly, why that speed limit was there. And it's quite possible that, he said he lost his brakes. It's quite possible it was not a mechanical failure, but then it was brake fade, that, the brakes, when you use them too much going down the hill, they quit working properly. When Jim looked into this, he even wrote an article about mountain driving called The Art and Science of Mountain Driving, because it's not like just driving in Texas or Florida.
Yeah. And so what effects, there's been so much public outcry, what effects has that had on the trial?
Well, in an unusual step, the district attorney's office asked the judge to reconsider. They will recommend a 20 to 30-year sentence. This is not typical. Usually it's the defendant's attorneys that would ask that kind of thing. It was so unusual that there was a hearing right after Christmas just to look at the procedural questions dealing with the case. So a hearing date was set for January 13th for the judge to consider the case. However, before that hearing could happen, on December 30th, Colorado Governor Jared Polis granted Aguilera Madero's clemency, and he reduced his sentence to just 10 years with eligibility for parole in 5.
Let's switch gears to look at number 2 on the list. Nikola touts battery electric and fuel cell truck progress.
Yeah, that was an interesting story. I had just seen a tweet about Nikola, their first pre-series battery electric trucks rolling off their line in the Coolidge, Arizona facility. Went to write something up about it and ran into a few other things. They'd also recently started track testing of their fuel cell version. Both of these are called the Nikola Tray. I found a series of videos from Sandy Monroe about his visit to Nikola. He's a former Ford engineer turned consultant, apparently well known in the automotive business, and he was pretty impressed by his visit. He checked out the battery electric version, the fuel cell versions, which are in much earlier stages of development, and he said that he was pretty impressed. So it'll be really interesting to see where we go from here.
Great. And I know this has been really a busy month. I noticed for news coming from Nikola, after we published that story, news came out that the company had delivered their first battery electric pilot trucks to Total Transportation Services, Inc., or TTSI, for use at ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach. And then soon after that, bulk carrier HDT Transportation System said it would also acquire 10 Nikola Tre battery electric trucks from Thompson Truck Centers. And so both TTSI and HDT promised to buy a total of 100 after the successful implementation or deployment of these initial units.
Yeah, and so that was kind of the good news for Nikola. But interestingly, same month, we also had some news resulting from 15 months ago when Nikola founder Trevor Milton left the company amidst allegation of fraud, an investigation by the Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And shortly before Christmas, the SEC announced that Nikola had agreed to pay $125 million to settle the charges that it defrauded investors by misleading them about just how far along it was in developing its products. I don't know if you might remember that there were reports that when they first unveiled the Nikola several years ago, that it wasn't actually, couldn't actually run on its own power. So a busy month indeed for Nikola.
Indeed. And so third on our list was the abrupt closing of Texas less than truckload carrier Central Freight Lines. And this was a more than 2,000 employee business, and it had been around for 96 years. So what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, in a time where a lot of fleets are just, going gangbusters because of, tight capacity, high demand. But according to published reports, the Texas-based company had taken on a lot of debt. It was buying up trucking companies, even as its financial situation was already shaky. It lost its biggest customer, Amazon, and apparently that put it in a hole it couldn't dig itself out of, even with the help of a $10 million PPP loan from the Paycheck Protection Program, which was designed to help companies get through the COVID-19 pandemic. And kind of looking back over the past decade, the company had gone public and then it had gone private again, bought by Jerry Moyes, founder of Swift. But, less than truckload is a very different animal from the truckload world. So you have to wonder if that had played any factor into that.
Sure. So number 4 was the Biden administration's new plan to help trucking recruit and retain new drivers. So the Department of Labor and the Department of Transportation jointly announced a number of short-term and long-term initiatives to address this driver shortage. This included things like launching a pilot program for younger drivers, making it easier for truck drivers or trucking companies rather to use the registered apprenticeship program. Deborah, do you think that these initiatives will help?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting to see the Department of Labor and the Department of Transportation working together on this. Yeah. The Truck Action Plan, as it's called, is part of the administration's Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force, which was launched in June to address supply chain bottlenecks. And a lot of the effort so far has been focused on the port situations. As far as the driver part of this, in my opinion, most of these initiatives are not going to help right away. The nearest term one is efforts to help states speed up their licensing procedures. A lot of states are still having backlogs from license offices being closed during COVID. So the government spending some money and helping tips and stuff to help with that. More long-term parts of it, for instance, a big piece of it was emphasizing these registered apprenticeships programs. These are overseen by the Department of Labor, and apparently they are kind of a nightmare of red tape. The Trump administration had tried to set up an alternative industry-driven apprenticeship program, but it never really got off the ground. So DOT and DOL have now announced a 90-day goal to sign up trucking companies and unions and associations and other groups that might put these programs together. And they're going to try to cut the red tape and get some of these programs established. They said in as little as 48 hours. Now, obviously, getting it established and actually, as far as the red tape goes, and then actually getting drivers through the program and behind the wheel is not nearly as immediate, but that's an interesting development, I thought. And another example of longer term initiatives was that the two departments are going to work together to study driver compensation and driver retention. And I think that's important. It'll be interesting to see if it tells us anything we don't already know.
Yeah.
But Vesna, you've been talking to a number of fleets this past year about driver retention. What do you think? You think the government can find ways to somehow scale the most successful tactics to an entire industry?
Yeah, so I think the fleets I talk with who have higher retention rates for their drivers have a lot in common, and a lot of things like focus on company culture and internal mentorship programs for incoming drivers. And from my reporting, it's clear that those practices are, they're not a secret. These fleets want to share. They want the industry as a whole to succeed. So what I think that these government initiatives are best positioned to do is to help really amplify those messages and best practices through those studies, through those programs. So with this announcement, at the very least, the government has acknowledged that the trucking and drivers are an integral part of the supply chain. And I think that's really the first step in finding, and like you said, cutting all that red tape, which creates barriers even for these fleets I'm talking to who are doing like quote unquote everything right internally.
Yeah, it's, and the driver shortage is nothing new. Last 30 years I've been hearing about it. Anytime basically there's not a recession, but it does seem that it is, had reached a peak kind of point here that we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
So anyway, rounding out our top 5 stories for December was news that Rush Enterprises, which operates the largest network of commercial vehicle dealerships in North America, just got even bigger. They acquired 16 more Peterbilt and International dealerships, and its biggest acquisition yet. And that's a wrap on our top 5 stories from December. Vesna, thanks for doing this with me, and we're going to try to do this every month.
Yeah.
In the meantime, be sure to go to truckinginfo.com. You can click on newsletter at the top to subscribe to our daily headline news. That'll also get you a weekly rundown of the most popular news of the week. And follow us on social media. Listen to HDT Talks Trucking on your favorite podcast platform, or watch the video version on Trucking Info or YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.